Science and Culture, Nonverbal Cross-Cultural Communication Project by Brad, Jake, Max, and Caleb.
Cornerstone's current nonverbal training consists of just one night of training for 6 hours, and they basically focus on some of the differences between countries' direct and indirect forms of communication. They also do a little bit of kind of what's culturally acceptable for each country, but they do not go into very much focus on nonverbal or facial reading, and they're not very focused on separate countries that people are going to. This is up to the professors to do more in-depth training. One example of what they do train people in is what is acceptable in the specific culture, such as being overly excited. The first study that we viewed was whether body language recognition is better in older or younger adults. The question was, is there an age-related difference in a person's ability to interpret body language? They compared both younger adults and older adults in a study and gave them each short videos of people expressing emotions, but then they could not hear the audio in those videos. The result was that older adults were much more likely to make errors than the younger adults, especially where the actor portrayed exaggerated or neutral emotions.
The second study was emotional expression using synthesized facial muscle movements. The question asked is what factors come into play in distinguishing emotion through facial expression. The study consisted of comparison between synthetic, drawn images of facial muscle actions with photographs of real people and real facial expressions. The result was the average accuracy of determining the emotion for the synthetic images was much lower than the still photographs. However, many other factors such as color, facial features, and types of gaze were included in the still images compared to the synthetic.
We will now talk about the relevance of these two studies to whether short-term missions should use training for nonverbal cues. The first study discusses whether differences in age affect ability to process movements and gestures. Now, this helps us understand which emotions younger people struggle with recognizing. The study indicates that both young and old people struggle with recognizing happy and sad emotions. This can be used because now we know which emotions we should focus on when training individuals that go on short-term missions.
In the second study, it was found that emotions cannot be best determined by facial muscle movement alone. The determining factor lies in gaze, position, facial features, and that is included with facial action. As an added discovery, the study showed that fear is the emotion that was the hardest to distinguish among others.
Evaluation of the first study. The first study was conducted with 82 young and old adults that were part of the study as two portions. The subjects viewed short video clips of people's body language with no audio and tried to identify the emotion that was portrayed in those clips. There were no control groups, as there was just the two main groups of young and old, and there were only two experimental groups, the younger and the older. The sample size was 41 participants, 18 through 21 years, and 41 participants that were 65 through 89 years. The assignment of the subjects was based solely on age, again, 18 to 21 years old and 65 to 89 years old. Controlled variables, since this was a correlation study and not technically an experiment, there weren't any control variables. Instead, there were just the two experimental groups. All the results were presented in tables, and all the data was in different layouts. This study shows that adults are less accurate at depicting body movements and gestures as cues to emotions. A few findings that we pulled were younger and older people can only recognize happy and sad emotions 70 to 75% of the time, and they can recognize angry emotions close to 90% of the time.
For the second study, the evaluation was studying whether judges can correctly recognize facial expressions just based on muscle movement alone. This is comparing synthetic images and still photographs. There is no control group, but there is an experimental group, and that consisted of the French-speaking psychology students. The sample size was the 114 French-speaking psychology students, which had a mean age of 25.8. The assignment of subjects was to see if they can determine the emotions of a set of static images or faces. The controlled variables of the second study was the amount of stimuli included, which consists of happiness, surprise, anger, sadness, fear, and disgust, and about 21 stimuli were included altogether. The results of the study provided, it was a study recognition table, and it showed that 75.86% could recognize fear, and 68.14% could recognize sadness. These results show that fear and sadness were more commonly misinterpreted.
In light of these studies, a recommendation would be to do basic training on nonverbal communication. Even though some nonverbal training is currently used, it doesn't go into specifics. Through the two studies that we used, we found that happiness and sadness are recognized 70 to 75% of the time, while fear is recognized about 75%. And while that's not bad, if through some basic training, we could boost that up to above 90%. And our idea is to have students complete a short activity of determining specific facial and body language cues using short videos of people. And that would just help us to get specific training in so that people know can apply it directly when they're in the field and be able to do so like that.
For integration into a biblical worldview, as we interact with people in different countries, we can better communicate if we have the ability to decode facial and body expressions. In Matthew 28, Jesus gives his disciples the Great Commission to go and make disciples of all nations. In order to do this effectively, we should strive to communicate as well as we can with people in foreign countries. Learning about nonverbal communication can allow us to have a greater impact on individuals and communities around the world. It can train us to know the right way to respond in certain situations. We have been commissioned to help our brothers and sisters see Christ, and we can do that through the understanding of emotional cues.
Compared with Cornerstone's current nonverbal analysis, we think that training for short-term missions would be very beneficial and help us to boost up past that 90%. Being able to provide all students involved with short-term missions with training on nonverbal decoding would help individuals better understand and communicate with people overseas. And this would help further the effectiveness of each individual as well as the team's impact overall.